Are on. So I'm going to ratchet my voice up a little bit. Our purpose today, we have an agenda that perhaps you've had. Our purpose is really two things: to mark this year, review what our purpose was this year, what our accomplishments were through the year, and to recognize the work done by many people in this room, wherever you're sitting, and many others. But then take a look ahead and look at what's next, where we are with that. And in that process, executive work group members will invite you to make some comments about what's next phase of our work. So let's start with introductions around the table. Maybe start over here with Julie.
Julie Higgins, City of Olympia.
Cheryl Selby, City of Olympia, and I'm hoping to have a better weekend than some mud snails I know.
Bill McGregor, Port of Olympia. Commissioner.
Tessa Gardner-Brown with Floyd Snyder supporting BES. I'm here on behalf of Jessie Massengale. She's obviously typically the one facilitating and presenting these sessions. She's not here with us today. She was up at 3:30 trying to make the travel from Bend, but they had terrible snow and it didn't work out. So she is sending best wishes and again wishes she could be here. And I'll be the gal from Floyd Snyder.
Thank you for being here. And Bob.
Bob Covington, DES Deputy Director.
And Paul facilitating.
Pete Kamat, Tumwater Mayor.
Pete, this is Neil. Neil, this is Pete.
How you doing?
Jeff Dickinson, Squaxin Tribe.
Neil McClanahan, I got introduced over City of Tumwater.
And Chris Liu, Director for the Department of Enterprise Services.
And we had invites out for some elected officials who might have joined us. I think Commissioner Downing, you're...
Joe Downing, Port of Olympia. Hi.
Right?
Thank you.
Are there any other elected officials?
Shauna Myers, County Treasurer.
Oh, that's right. Hi.
Soon to be.
Good to see you. Yeah. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Any others? Okay. Minutes. Minutes were sent out. We had one comment from one person. There were no changes. Any reasons to not finalize the minutes?
They look good.
Yeah, they look good to us too.
Okay. With that, we'll consider them finalized. They are on, this is the meeting, which we need to do that. So, okay, minutes are finalized. So our agenda, we're going to do an overview of Phase 1 goals with Chris, and then the accomplishments in Phase 1 and some recognitions before we move on to looking forward. So Chris, accomplishments.
Thank you, Paul.
Excuse me, the overview of Phase 1 goals.
Thank you, Paul. In order to save time, I'm going to stick strictly to my bullet points over here that my staff has prepared. Basically, what this process was in this Phase 1 is twofold. Number one is to complete the proviso that was passed in the last budget. And also to make sure that we had a working relationship among all the governments who have to make decisions around the issue of Capitol Lake. So I think, having said that, I think we've garnered a great working relationship with our local governments, something that I think that could serve as a model as we go forward in the future. While we end Phase 1 and we end this particular executive committee for Phase 1, we hope that the collaboration will continue on to Phase 2, as I'm sure it will be, and as we gather again, as if we get the budget to actually do that. So we've been proactively engaged with the governments, with the citizens, and with stakeholders for this completion of Phase 1, and I think it's essential that we tackled a number of really thorny issues, not to solve the issues at this particular point, but to set up the issues so they can be solved in the next phase. We also wanted to make sure that we completed all the proviso goals, and in just a few minutes here, you're going to hear about reaching those goals in the proviso, and to set us up for Phase 2. So Phase 1 is to set us up for Phase 2, which is the EIS process. I also want to thank all our sister agencies, Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Ecology, specifically the Department of Natural Resources. Commissioner Goldmark has been a particular advocate for our work here, and he's done great work to help us out and to move us forward. The Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation has made sure that we're staying true to preserve tribal rights and making sure that if we run across anything that we're going to follow the proper procedures for preserving that. And there were probably more agencies that I did not mention today, but I want to recognize everybody who had a part in that. Numerous people and departments to really talk about each one of them individually. I just want to thank everybody for coming together and making this all possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, back to you.
Before we do, good to see you again. Commissioner, we did introductions a second ago. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bud Blake. I'm a Thurston County Commissioner and look forward to the phase 1, phase 2 process.
So, accomplishments of phase 1. And also, update, we met in October. A lot of work since then, so kind of an update about where that work sits today as we look at the accomplishments for phase 1.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe I'll just wind back the clock a bit further than the October meeting and start when we first met at the beginning of this year. And as we all know, as we've talked about many times, the real catalyst for this meeting is the proviso that was attached to the 2015-2017 capital budget, but also DES and Chris spearheading and looking at that proviso in a really critical way and trying to understand how can we maximize our benefits from the work that's attached to this charge. And the charge, we all know, is that we were tasked to reach broad agreement on a long-term plan for the management of Capitol Lake Lower Deschutes watershed. In figuring out how we do that in the near term and also in the long term, DES came up with a plan to phase the approach, to consider the initial proviso and the directives in front of us as part of phase 1, getting the regulatory agencies together, getting the governmental partners together, engaging with the community and trying to understand what is out there, what do people want to see from the work that we're doing associated with this project, what is the level of interest and how can we move this forward to eventually land on a long-term plan. So that started our really intensive process. I'm sure you've all seen this. This is really the flow chart that we lived by. And what this outlines is not only the number of meetings that we had and the level and intensive outreach associated with the phase 1 process, it also breaks down the stakeholders that we have. And so when we discuss stakeholders as part of the phase 1 process, we look at several distinct groups, one being the executive work group around this table, the other being the technical committee that we relied on for technical support, drawing upon the natural resource agencies and their expertise. We also worked with the funding and governance committee to evaluate potential models for future shared funding and governance. And then additionally, beyond the scope of the proviso, DES engaged in conversations related to sediment management because that was a shared goal for all stakeholder groups regardless of long-term preference for long-term options. So that's the process that we have been on, meeting monthly with each group throughout the process and ensuring that we're obtaining feedback from each level and each perspective while we're getting policy level feedback from the executive board group, again, technical feedback from the technical committee and so on. So the intent of this process is really to help set us up for phase 2, and phase 2 would set up for phase 3. So as we move along this phased approach, they build upon each other. We conducted phase 1 as an expanded scoping period. And so that is our opportunity and DES's opportunity to understand what's out there, to identify long-term management options, to identify additionally what could be done. Sorry, excuse me, I totally just lost my thought there. Here we are.
You're doing great.
Well, great report.
Yeah, and that's the end of it.
Good job.
Sorry about that. So we are at the end of this process. As you know, the last time when we were meeting in October, we were discussing the contents of the proviso report. And the proviso report intended to summarize what we had done throughout this process. Additionally, throughout that time, as we were beginning to close up the process, we had a great discussions with the resource agencies where they intended to and asked to express additional support for the process. So specifically, those resource agencies as engaged through both the Funding and Governance Committee and the technical committees, so those being Ecology, WDFW, and DNR, said, hey, we are in full support of this phase process that you're conducting, especially moving from phase 1 into phase 2, where we would have the opportunity to evaluate potential long-term management options, the impacts and benefits of those long-term management options, and get a better understanding of what the future might look like for Capitol Lake Lower Deschutes watershed. So we consider that a big win, understanding that the resource agencies are behind BES with moving forward. Additionally, some of the other work products or really kind of tangible items that would help move us into the phase 2 process, where we get into a project-specific EIS and get to evaluate the potential impacts and benefits of long-term management options, are a few things. As part of this process, we discussed goals and objectives, and in our April meetings, we had a survey, and 421 respondents provided input to us as part of that survey and helped us really to understand what are the community, what are the goals from the regulatory agencies, what do people want to see. And we identified a broad range of goals and objectives, but also one of the most encouraging things out of that was that a number of the goals and objectives have stayed the same and are similar regardless of long-term management options. I'll name the top 6 that have been consistent since the early process in the 1990s. So aesthetics, sediment management, recreational opportunities, water quality, economics, and habitat. Those have remained consistent, and again, regardless of long-term management options, those are important to all stakeholders. So with that identification of goals and objectives, we created and developed in a number of iterations with all of the stakeholders a purpose and need statement. As we've described to you, the purpose and need statement is really kind of the crux or one of the foundational pieces for an environmental impact statement. It helps to focus the direction of those evaluations, and it helps to express our ideas about what we as a community, we as a group of people want for this project. So we consider that another big piece, and that will move forward through the proviso report and also into the environmental impact statement in phase 2. Additionally, just to touch on a couple other pieces that we've all worked together on, the project bibliography. As we all know, this system has been studied for many decades, and as part of this process, we, Jesse, the group of technical folks, really wanted to look at what's the body of research out there. And so we asked and engaged with you, and we have a list of over 200 documents related to this system. And that's all compiled and put together now and can be a resource for when we're evaluating in the next phase. One of the key items that we focused on as part of this process is what are potential new ideas and new concepts for long-term management of Capitol Lake? What else is out there? And not only just potential new options for long-term management, but are there other components that we have overlooked or that we haven't thought of yet that we can integrate into long-term management options? For example, the eradication of the New Zealand mud snail. We've talked about that a number of times throughout this series of meetings, but that's something that we say, hey, regardless of long-term management option, that should be integrated as a primary component of the work moving forward. And so we've had the opportunity to prepare a list, and that'll move forward again into phase 2, and memorializes some of those important components that hopefully wouldn't have been lost otherwise. Moving now from kind of the main body of work, we also again worked with several stakeholders. The Funding and Governance Committee met a number of times, and their charge was to evaluate models for potential shared funding and governance. But additionally, as part of that work, they helped to conceptualize and brainstorm, what if we could do this in our way, what would we want that model to look like? And they came up with 10 attributes that they feel could be the foundation of any model moving forward. I think beyond that, in those discussions, there was strong commitment of the agencies that were at the table to continue working to develop that model, to identify opportunities for a long-term shared funding and governance, and move throughout the phase 2 process collaboratively with DES, and we consider that a huge success. Two more items that I'll hit on. So again, DES, the proviso itself didn't describe work focused particularly on sediment management, but we have heard from all the stakeholders and from DES, this is an important component. It continues to be a primary goal and objective, sediment management, and so we had conversations around when is the right time to look and convene additional analysis or modeling as needed to identify potential impacts or benefits of an open system. When do we do that? What's the right time? And we did that. We took two kind of charges with that. One was to evaluate what's out there. And so we worked with a geomorphologist who has experience in completing and building sediment models to look at the work that was done as part of the 2006 effort. And his conclusion from that was that it's a great body of work, and that model could be built upon and refined as we move forward. Additionally, what we heard is that, yes, it does make sense as part of phase 2 when we're evaluating all the other potential impacts and benefits of the project to look at sediment management there. And so there's an approach, again, a consistent, comprehensive approach for moving forward. Finally, we pulled together the phase 1 report, and the phase 1 report is currently in review with OFM. It has been revised since you saw it last based on the feedback from this group and additionally from the technical committee and the community, because as with all of our work products, they're reviewed by the full stakeholder group. I'll briefly summarize kind of the few changes to that, and then the real takeaway message is that we are anticipating that as the next step, the phase 1 report is submitted to the legislature, but really after that's submitted to the legislature, it becomes the document that summarizes what we've done, and phase 2 hopefully can build upon that body of work. So I'm gonna do a quick time check. Is it best?
Good. I'll do a quick, just what happened in October and where we are now in terms of the report.
Sure, absolutely. So in October, after we met, we revised, as I mentioned, and I'll go through some of the items the changes that we made, and then the report was submitted to OFM. We anticipate, or we are expecting their feedback on the 23rd of this month. We, as part of this process, also worked with OFM, so they understand what's in the report, what it's saying, kind of some of the analysis and findings that we've had, and after we receive their comments and feedback on the 23rd, we will again be closing it up for final submittal to the legislature. The items, since we have last met on October 28th, we have included a summary of existing conditions for water quality and habitat in Capitol Lake, and that's a result specifically of one of the directives in the proviso and in response to a request. And we have also integrated that components table that really kind of discusses some additional components that could be included in the long-term management options into the report, so it gets more kind of real estate, people can see it and find it more easily. We've also, as part of the sediment management chapter, we've made a couple tweaks there in response to feedback from the technical committee. They had some good feedback about how to refine that language. And then additionally, we wanted to, because we talked about that 2006 modeling report, we put forward a graphic that really depicts and demonstrates where the areas of deposition would be. And then that is included next to the discussion that says, we would look at this in more detail as part of the Phase 2 EIS, and we would identify potential mitigation if this deposition were to result in impacts. As a result of comments from the community, we have included a brief discussion about the history of Capitol Lake and the continued importance of aesthetics. And additionally, we have discussed that the project would be planned and implemented in a comprehensive approach. We've always said that, and we wanted to make sure that we were including that kind of written language in the report. The final thing that I'll mention is that we have made some updates to the formatting and the layout of how the long-term management options are presented. As a result of the conversation that we had in October, there was a request for all of the options that didn't have the full thorough review to be packaged in one section, and we have done that. Similarly, we have updated the seasonal hybrid that is also in that same section to be refined as requested by the technical committee. So those are kind of the key updates. There are no substantive changes that have been made to the report. That really does kind of give you a summary consistent with the email that we sent out. The last thing I'll say about the long-term management options and the new concepts and everything that's come forward is that the intent is that all of those options, everything that we've heard from the community, everything that we've heard from the technical committee and from the executive work group, spanning from small components to full long-term management options, that moves forward into Phase 2. That is a huge intent of this process, is to identify and to allow Phase 2 to evaluate. So we have always maintained that everything that we've talked about as part of this process will be moved forward for further evaluation in Phase 2, and we look forward to the potential for Phase 2 happening.
Any questions or other thoughts about accomplishments for Phase 1?
So I have just perhaps it's a question comment. So everything that's contained in this current report will move forward into Phase 2, no matter where it is, it appears in the report. This includes the bibliography, all the studies that have been done, for further evaluation, the appendixes, and all the report on the proviso itself gets included in the next phase.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
When will we get a copy of the final Phase 1 report?
We would like to send it out to all of the stakeholders and make it available for executive work group and the community on December 30th when it goes to the legislature.
So by the end of the year, it'll be up on the website, like a link that people can go download it. Okay.
Yep.
And then will staff be available to brief our councils and commissions in the first quarter of 2017? And we're getting a lot of questions from our council mates. It's like, when do we get briefed on this? So will staff be available to help us with that?
Sure, we'll make it available. If we could get your meeting dates ahead of time so we could schedule that.
We're starting to block them out, so this is
Perfect.
Any questions or comments on accomplishments of Phase 1? With that, Chris and Executive Worker, recognition of community involvement.
Well, I'd like to combine both of these next two phases or pieces together. I have to say that we had tremendous response from the community for community involvement, having meetings. There was a little quip made by many of us around the table that we've had more public meetings than the 520 bridge. And I went back and I counted actually how many meetings they had on the 520 bridge, and I say we come pretty darn close. But I really would like to recognize the numerous individuals that have been in the room. I can't name everybody, the list is long and distinguished. And two organizations that have given us numerous input that I think typifies some of the options that we had to consider. The organization named DIRT and the organization named CLIPA. I want to thank them for their contributions and for their tenacity in giving us the information that we need and being advocates for their positions and recognizing that they have a stake in the work that we're going to be doing as we finish up phase 1, and more importantly, as we move into phase 2. Their participation is going to be critical. I also like to recognize the members of the Technical and Funding Governments Committee. So if were members of either of those two committees in any form or fashion, would you please stand and be recognized? Those of us who are around the table, some of us are scientists and some of us are not. Most of us are not. The technical committees really form the basis of vetting a lot of the information that we were looking for in the proviso, and we couldn't have done this work without them. So I really appreciate the collaboration that we had. We had folks come out from DNR and Ecology and Fish and Wildlife, as well as from each of the governments. Sitting here at the table had volunteers who actually worked on these committees and provided background and the actual science that we used to vet some of the items. But talking about the science, it was not definitive science, and we weren't looking for a definitive solution, but to move the issues forward to the EIS where they would be fully vetted. So I think the other thing that I wanted to note is I spoke about before was the collaboration of all parties in the technical, in the governance committees, and in the executive group about talking about the issues and putting aside whatever differences might have been perceived. So it's a great example of how our governments can actually work together. I especially like to thank the Squaxin Island Tribe, because they've been a bellwether for us in helping us organize ourselves and gather and move the issues on forward. So I'd like to recognize them particularly. So thank you very much, Jeff, for participating. So you want me to just roll to the next section here?
Not on the any comments on the recognition. Executive work group members, and as you're thinking of what you want to say, I would like to recognize Senator Frazier, who just joined us, who shepherded the proviso that launched this process. So we've just reviewing the accomplishments of this year and how it's setting up the next phase. So
Excellent, thank you.
Before we do move on to the looking ahead to what's next, any thoughts or comments on recognizing community technical committee governance from members of the executive work group?
Go ahead. I'll just make a couple of comments. First of all, an amazing amount of work done by Floyd Schneider, LaSure, DES staff, and our technical staff pulling all this information together. I wasn't part of the clamp process. I really, frankly, paid a lot of attention to all the huge volume of material that was generated previously. So having that history, having some of those technical documents, just a list and some summary of them, I think is extremely valuable. And so I really appreciate the work that was done there. And I think it represents a great foundation for the future. And I continue to remain concerned about the water quality impacts and degradation in the lake and Lower Bud Inlet. I think we've got some potentially huge challenges there if we don't resolve those issues. And so I really hope we can move forward and try and get this issue resolved, because if we don't, I think it will have an adverse economic impact on our communities ultimately. So I just appreciate the work that's been done. I know a lot of staff put a lot of time into this, in addition to the consultant, and I think we've got a good foundation to move ahead. Thanks.
Any other comments recognized?
I just want to recognize that each of the entities probably didn't have this in their work plans when they were looking at 2016 back in 2015, and I think it's an indication of our wanting to cooperate and see this move forward as a whole, as a group. And so I appreciate the staff times and resources that were used by each one of the entities to facilitate those other two groups as well as this group here. So I think it's an indication to the community, I hope, that we are trying to move this forward. I have other remarks, but I'll save them for the end.
Any other thoughts, comments on the recognizing all the work done by so many folks in this room and otherwise? So Chris, yes, review of the submittal schedule, what's next, and then we'll open it up for comments by executive work group members. And I haven't noted the reception, so let me note the reception to recognize and thank everybody for all the work, which we'll move to here before long.
Great. So I'll read directly from my notes. I think Tessa had already mentioned that the report went to OFM for review on December the 1st with comments expected back by the 23rd. We haven't had any indication that there's going to be any sort of substantial changes to the documents. I think there was a couple of spelling errors. I don't know how that happens with Word nowadays. And a couple of punctuations, but very, very minor types of changes. So we felt comfortable in presenting today. The final report will be submitted to the legislature on December 3rd, and it will be public at that particular time. The final report will be posted to the DES website like we posted all the other reports, so we're not changing that procedure. DES submitted a request for funding to move to an EIS Phase 2 as part of the 17-19 capital budget request. The governor's budget just came out day before yesterday, and the project is included in the governor's budget request. We will now be waiting to see what the legislature actually does. We have two more budgets to wait from, one from the House and one from the Senate. If funded, Phase 2 could begin as early as 2018, and after a standard public bidding and consultant contracting process, we could award a contract to move forward. Phase 2 includes completion of an EIS and associated technical analysis with public comment, and would take about 3 years to do. That's estimated. We're not saying it will take the full 3 years, but could. And that's my report to the executive committee.
Sure.
A quick question, Chris. In the governor's budget, was it fully funded at $5.5 million?
The governor's budget can only fund for 2 years. So what you're seeing there, because the process could take 3 years, was the funding for the first piece of it.
What does that cost?
About $4 million, roughly in that area. Our budget analysts are still going through the numbers to break it down fully.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
And so, just for clarity, so the rest of the funding anticipated would happen in another budget cycle, and therefore it could be adjusted up or down depending on how well the first $4 million gets spent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other questions about what happens next? With that, I think we're at the final remarks from the executive work group.
I can lead off with a remarkable document that we are going to be submitting here soon. I wanted to take, before that, a little time to talk about that chart that you were holding up earlier. Tessa, could you hold it up again? So when that was first presented to us, it took many iterations before it came back in that form. That just made my head explode. I mean, you've got layers of government around this table. You've got a strata of stakeholders here and in the room and as well across the community. How many touch points through each process? 2 touch points. The information came through all those different work groups, and then a deliverable that we're about to celebrate in a very compressed time frame, because at some point, we didn't even know whether this was really funded, right? We had to wait, yeah.
For the
So-
first year, we didn't know.
Yes, and even the first quarter of this year, it seemed like we're like, oh no. So I just want to commend Floyd Snyder for being a steady Eddie, getting us all through this, and for DES and Chris and Carrie and where's Carrie? For making us feel like we were constantly updated. It made it easy for us to go back to our councils and our commissions and say, this is where we are right now. And the community input, I think, was remarkable, is evidenced by the amount of people that participated in an online survey, right? And so obviously our community is passionate about finding a resolution to this. So next steps are going to be, of course, advocating for phase 2. And this letter that all of us have signed around this table will be a big component of that process. As well, this funding of phase 2 was recently adopted as 3 key funding issues for the regional legislative priorities, that 9 different components came together, governments and departments that are going to be lobbying for this funding as well. And we're feeling that having that show of strategic partners supporting this phase 2 EIS funding will give us broader outreach amongst our legislative districts, not just LD22, but beyond. So I'm really, really excited about the EIS being part of that regional prioritization for our legislative emphasis. So with that, the only other question, I don't have another question. It's more just that this letter that all of us have signed, I think it's an historic document in that we have the Squaxin tribe represented on this letter. I can't thank you enough, Jeff, for walking through this process with us. I know it's been sometimes not so clear cut what your role would be, but we really appreciate you staying with us on that, and we hope that continues. So this letter I'd like to submit to Chris Liu to take it where it needs to go.
Thank you.
And thank all of our workmates here tonight, or this morning.
Thank you, Cheryl.
So I just want to be clear that what Cheryl has handed me is a letter of support from all the governments sitting around the table.
Yeah, I guess I should have said what I was handing you.
And it says support for Capitol Lake, Lower Deschutes watershed environmental impact statement as long-term management and planning for phase 2. So this is an endorsement letter, for lack of better words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl.
Yes.
I think I appreciate Mayor Selby's words. I know early in the process, and it was mentioned CLAMP, and I want to recognize that 2 individuals that are sitting around the table were involved in CLAMP for the number of years it existed. It would be Jeff Dickinson from the Squaxin tribe, as well as Mayor Pro Tem McClanahan. And while I was involved in CLAMP for a couple of years, those 2 have lived it, breathed it, and so I appreciate the energies you put into there. And now we've moved to another stage, and I think the community is ready to move on with this, and ready to, as one public comment at one of our commission meetings was, make a decision. And I think this is the first step in making that decision, from going from phase 1 to phase 2. Although it will be another 3 years before we probably get to the end of that decision, at least we're moving and progressing in that manner. And I think the outcome will be, which may not be agreeable to all, but will at least have been properly vetted, I believe, in the phase 2 portion of this EIS. And so I'm encouraged by that. And as I said before, I think that the public involvement that's happened up to this point has been very good. You held separate meetings after decisions were made. And so I think that individuals hopefully have felt heard. And as this moves forward, and those other options that have been looked at are going to be vetted in this system, as I heard from Chris, I'm enthused about that. So I think that this is the start of a process getting through one phase, moving into the next, and then moving into what may be the third phase, which is a decision to move forward, so we can all do that as a community. So I unfortunately have to leave early, and I won't be able to take part of the reception, but I do applaud my fellow members around the board for being involved and being here almost consistently every time for one of these meetings. I had to miss one, and I regretted not being here, but I still enjoyed the comradeship, the cooperation, and the discussions that happen around the table. So thank you very much.
Bud?
Yeah, I have a question. Being the first time here, 30 December is kind of the date I have in mind to ask my question. What do we do from here till when we kick off phase 2 as far as this executive body and all the others involved? What's to be expected in a timeline of participation?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Yeah, what do we do from here till when we get to a phase 2 portion of this, as far as this body governance and what have you, as far as timeline and participation?
Well, we are, I'm not sure if I'm going to describe this correctly, but we're going to kind of go on hiatus. But we're going to keep each of the executive members informed as we move along in the process. And if we're approved, because I have a suspicion that it's going to be a rather long session this year, if we're approved, then we'll reformulate with the same partnership executive team. At least that's what our intent is. And then we'll make further decisions from that point.
I think as well, we should be making ourselves available to go up to the legislature to advocate for the funding with these different groups that are going to be lobbying.
Thank you. Yes. I didn't mean we're going to go to sleep or anything.
Okay.
I was just going to say that I think that there is an opportunity for DES, maybe on a monthly cycle to just be keeping this group informed via email updates or phone call to let you know what they're hearing, how it's going, if there's anything that needs to have the larger kind of group think. But otherwise, that would be their initiative to take forward, and they've talked about doing that.
Other executive work group comments?
Thank you. I want to thank, on behalf of the tribe and the tribal council, you members of the executive work group, in particular as you represent your respective governments. It's been very important to the tribe to engage in this process on a government-to-government level, and we appreciate your thinking in that regard. As you know, many of us talked and concluded some time ago that we had more work to do on this subject, and in particular regarding getting some more work done on sediment management. While I admit a certain amount of frustration that we have not been able to accomplish any of that in this phase, in as much as we're kind of distracted by the proviso, we are encouraged that you are all supportive of seeking funding to do that in the next phase. And it will certainly be necessary. It's certainly, from our perspective, the biggest problem to solve. And we appreciate your commitment to that, as it will certainly provide us with the justification to keep working along this path as opposed to pursuing some other alternative action strategy to accomplish some outcomes. So thank you.
Thanks.
And I have to leave early as well. I told Bill I'd be out the door, but
You won. Thank you, though, for staying. Any other executive work group comments?
I'll circle back around. I know we mentioned Senator Frazier's help in this regard, but it's not just this last phase that she helped tee up for us. It's many, many years of advocacy for figuring out a path forward for the management of Capitol Lake. And so I just want to thank her once again for all of her service. And we're hoping that we can call you to help us with some more advocacy going forward. And,
I'll be around.
all right, thank you.
So I'd like to add on to your comments because I think some of us are not aware of what an advocate she's been. She's not only been an advocate, she's been a mechanic, she's been a technical advisor. She's done just a wonderful job to keep the process moving, and whenever I needed advice, she was always there and available to take my phone calls and to give me sage-like advice, and a couple times I didn't follow it, I regretted it. So I really want to thank her not only for the fact that she's helping us, but her contributions to government in general, her years of service, dedicated service, very unselfish services, is recognized specifically by, I think, all of us in this room, and by me specifically. You've had a great influence on how I act in government, and I really appreciate your leadership. So thank you.
And I thank each of you because I know how dedicated and committed and hardworking each of you are. So thank you. And happy to.
Are there other comments that executive worker members would like to make? Going once? Twice? No. With that, we've come to a close.
Fantastic.
Early.
So, balloon drop. Where's the balloon drop?
The reception starts now. Wonderful treats in the back. Please stay and enjoy that. Mix and mingle until we meet again officially, huh?
Yes.
And take on phase 2 after funding's in place. We're adjourned.
How much?